Do you really want to develop a plan where you consciously exclude everybody in the world with which you have the most naturally important connections? And children will, for all human history, fall in that category. Now, it's different if your kids are bad or they've done terrible things to you or others, but that's not the case here. It's often not the case. So my criticism, in a way, is what the person who did the estate planning even wanted here.
Welcome to Life's Third Act, an enlightening look at estate planning, retirement, and beyond.
Welcome to another episode of Life's Third Act. We're picking up with what I think will be part two. Forgive me if it ends up being part three, but a segment in which we're focusing on the Everly brothers, but we're focusing on Don in particular. We think that their story is a fascinating story, incredibly talented people, but who ran into what we would say are some bad calls toward the end, and their estate planning was not what I think that they would have had it be. And really, we're focusing on Don here. And Don's family, we've had a chance to connect with one of his daughters, Venetia. And so Venetia has just been very patient and willing to talk to us a little bit about the story, kind of the backstory, which is what really makes this series interesting and beneficial to all of us, in that we can see how various factors come into play in estate planning. It's not simply a legal matter. Any of you who've watched this for any period of time, you've seen that the problems that people have in we call it the final third, the last third of their lives, including their estate planning, so their plans for beyond their lives, the explanations are rarely simply legal. I mean, yes, there are legal mistakes, and that will be something I always give some attention to, but there are other factors that come into play, and we like to be able to watch and learn. And so this is an example of an opportunity to learn. So before you watch this, we encourage you to go back and watch the prior segments, but you don't have to. I think that there'll be enough context here. Plus, I'm going to do a little bit of a brief 30,000-foot review before we plunge into talking about the last 20 years or so of Don Everly's life with his daughter, Venetia. So let me also mention, though, that Don Everly's granddaughter, who is Arabella, which is, of course, the daughter of Venetia, is also participating, too. So I appreciate you all being able to make time for us today and to continue this discussion. I will start with a little bit of a summary, and then we'll pick up where we left off with our last discussion. So I'll assume everyone knows who the Everly brothers are. I mean, two incredibly famous, very talented, exquisite singers. They had a ton of hits in the very late 50s, early 60s. They didn't have the top 10 hits after, say, the early 60s, but they continued to be a vibrant force in music. So they performed together up until probably the mid-70s or so. Don't hold me to these dates, Venetia. And then they broke up, and they stayed broken up for a while. But then in the 80s, they got back together for a period of time, and then they broke back up thereafter. So there was some tension between the brothers, but it's not shocking to me at all. I mean, they started working together when they were at their parents, who are musicians, also, encouraged and tutored and nurtured them in that way. And so they had been working together for a long time, and some brothers can't do a single transaction together. I can tell you that as a lawyer, but to imagine, doing transactions, so to speak, day in and day out for 20 years or so.
Well, and sometimes record labels also kind of encourage that separation so they can go out on a solo and make some money that way as well, and then come back together, the big reunion tour that brings back even more money when they get back together.
That's a good point. You have people whispering in the ears of both musicians, and this is a common story in the music industry. Think of groups that broke up. You often have somebody whispering in the ear of one of them saying, look, you can do this on your own. Your ideas are better. Yeah, I think we saw something like this with the Beatles. So it's a common phenomenon. Anyway, so I'm not surprised that they broke up, but I should also mention here that they had some problems before. I think that Don Everly and his brother Phil both had some drug and alcohol problems, and and that might have been at least a part of Don's life up until the end. But we'll talk more about that. Anyway, so now we want to pick up at about the year, what is it, 1997, when Don marries. And Don marries a twin sister. They're twin sisters. I'm mentioning that she's a twin because it's relevant. So the sister that he married was Adela, and she had an identical twin, Adelaida. And so Adela and Adelaida, they both come into Don's life. I will tell you that Don stayed married to Adela for the balance of his life. And Adela, just a little bit of a thumbnail overview, and then Venetia, you'll fill in, much more detail. So Adela had problems with the legal system. She had some criminal issues of various sorts, often issues related to, maybe an act of violence, resisting arrest, or assault, or something like that. And much of it drug related. She had drug problems, as far as I know, even today. She's still alive. So her sister kind of came in and picked up in some ways. She lived with Don for a period of time. Adela came and went, had a conservatorship appointed for her, in which Don and I think her sister both served as co-conservators because she was in such a condition. It was psychiatric as well as drug related. So I think there were some psychiatric issues. So Adelaida had come into the household and was in a position of authority in many ways because arguably she was more capable than Don at this point in his life. She was substantially younger, 20 plus years younger. Is that right, Venetia?
Yes, yes.
So she was in a position to have a lot of influence vis-a-vis her sister as well as her brother-in-law. And Don, quite frankly, came to depend on her. And indications are that there was a relationship that developed, which incidentally, I can't imagine having somebody who looked identical to my wife living with me. My wife's gone, and whose personality probably was very similar if they're identical twins.
Get a little confusing.
Yeah, it would. So anyway, not surprising to me that this relationship developed. I think he confused her for Adela or whatever. But this is part of the controversy here is that the family, none of the children were participants in this stage of his life, I think virtually at all, subject to the exceptions you'll point out, Venetia, which I would argue are small exceptions. So he was kind of left in the care of these twins. And really one of the twins at the very end. So that sets the stage for our discussion here. So let's go back to 97. And Venetia, tell us how these two met. And your information, I should make clear, is not because you had an intimate relationship with your dad toward the end, because as we've already talked about, that he didn't have that relationship with his children. So much of what you know is through the other family members, and what interaction you've had with your with your dad. So tell us then about how he came into the circle of influence of these two women.
Well, my understanding was that he would, a lot of people have their own local bar they go to, and his was Brown's Diner. And I believe the twins, one or both the twins worked there. And I believe that's how they met. That's what I've been told multiple times. And this was probably in the early 90s. And at the time, my father probably had a serious girlfriend living with him and probably had other girlfriends on the side too. So take that how you want to.
So he liked the ladies is what you're saying. And
he didn't be alone.
And do you think that they knew from the get-go who he was and his history in the music business?
My guess is based on their age. They probably didn't know initially, but because he was there frequently, they probably were told at one point. And from what we were told initially, they came to Nashville to become musicians.
Mhm.
So that,
They were
to me,
songwriters,
that just sounded
musicians.
like a recipe for disaster. They saw a perfect target and opportunity and went with it.
So wait, so they were singers or something?
Singers and songwriters, yeah. So I mean, I guess they still are. I've never heard anything from them, but that was the I think believe why they moved to Nashville, the twins, to get it to have a music career.
So, and I can see how Don might be attracted to these women who are younger and attractive at that time, at least. He had known them for a while. It wasn't as if this was a whirlwind romance. It sounds like he had lived or dated one of them for probably 5 years.
In fact, he was dating multiple women when he started dating the first one, the wife.
Mhm.
So it definitely wasn't a like initial, oh, we fell in love. He was still dating other people. And the only reason that he ended up sticking with them was because apparently they scared every other girlfriend off.
Well,
So a little threatening, huh?
Well, that's what we've been told.
Yes.
Yeah.
That actually, I spoke to one of his on and off girlfriends, and she said she was scared.
So definitely not a romantic love story, in my opinion.
So did any of the things that are on the rap sheet of the ladies happen to any of the women that he was dating? Were any of the arrests because they did anything to those women? I know that there was some assaults.
I don't think so. I do think that some of the arrests from Adela were to do with domestic assault, which would be towards my father. And I do know that he had a restraining order against her and a restraining order for his dogs. So I think Adela might have been lashing out at her sister.
And at one point, a gun had been shot off in the house, and he was fearful. So we don't know any of the situation from that, but
That's later on.
Yeah.
But yes, later on in the like probably around 2018, 19, 20, there was the front windows in the house were shot out. Someone called me and told me, "Did you hear what happened at your dad's house?" And I'm like, "No." He lived only 10 minutes from me. I drove over and looked, and his house was boarded up the front. Later in my investigation of those 20 years, I saw on the 911 calls, there was over 75 911 calls to his house over those years. And I saw that one of them was for shots fired, and he obviously got the house boarded up.
Do you think that the ladies scared him into a relationship to where he felt like he couldn't leave?
I don't really think that. I think more that he was at a time where he wanted to get married and he wanted that security. And then I think by the time things were bad, because you heard stories of them both looking into divorce, Adela and my dad. And I think by that time he was elderly and had so many health
he couldn't
problems.
leave.
Yeah.
At that point, then he couldn't really leave, and he was
Right.
stuck.
I think that's an important way to characterize this situation with which some of our viewers may be familiar, maybe even personally, but if not, someone they know who he had gotten himself through his own decisions. There wasn't a big circle of friends around him. And so I think all evidence, it would be difficult to argue that he did not want to get in the situation he got into originally. I mean, he knew this woman, he knew their sister. Apparently he fell for one of them at least, or both. And he was with them for a substantial period of time when he could have gone. I mean, he was young enough, even though he had declined, that period from 97 to 07, just as an example, or 10, up to the point really even making the will, which we'll talk about in just a second, which was in 2011. It's hard to characterize him as being utterly in the thrall and captive to these women. I think he genuinely had some affection, or whatever the term may be, attraction to Adela, as well as eventually her sister. But I think that over time, he declined, and he became, there's nowhere else to go. And I imagine, do you agree with me, Venetia, the last 10 years plus?
I do agree. I don't think he knew any different. I don't know why he got to a point where he thought he deserved that kind of life. Maybe he was so guilt-ridden from his children, that he'd left us out of his life, and that he really didn't have anyone to turn to.
I think it's because of, what is that syndrome that when somebody's held captive? And
Stockholm syndrome.
Stockholm syndrome. I really think it's a situation exactly of that.
So in fairness, though, I want this to be clear as we paint this picture is Don had reason to know something about these women. I mean, having dated them so long, the tempers, the prone to, I don't know about the violence, but there's almost, for some men, there's an attraction to that sort of adventure. And these women, whatever we accuse them of, they probably weren't boring. And so I think that he must have been drawn to that. Now, he had his own drug and alcohol problems, right? Let's talk about that for a minute.
Well, once again, this is just from what I have heard. Yes, I heard that, he heavily partied in the 1990s. And I think after the marriage, it slowed down. And my understanding, it became more of a thing where he was using pain pills and OxyContin. But this is all things I can, just found out through my own investigation.
Well, that's reported elsewhere also. I think that the few people who had contact with him outside these women were, I think that the picture is one where that had been a part of his life for years, and he went in treatment for a period, didn't he?
Well, are you talking about in the 60s?
Yeah.
In the 60s, I also heard he was detoxed from drugs in 2017. I don't know if that was done through a medical source or if that was done at home. So that was something else,
So it might have been that after that, for all we know, we don't know whether he used the drugs after that. But we do know that from the police record and the what you call a rap sheet, there continued to be incidents with Adela. Is that correct? Now, Adelaida had some brushes with the law. Do you have that information in front of you, Sherry?
I sure do.
Shouldn't I know?
Yeah, the criminal trespassing, violation order protection. I mean, both the sisters have quite the rap sheet.
Yeah.
I've never met Adela in person, so I can't say. I have met Adelaida in person.
And what was that like, your meeting with her?
That was in 2014. That was the year that my Uncle Phil passed. And I was with another family member, and we were at the Americana in Nashville at the award show. And afterwards, someone goes, "Oh, Adelaida's here. You should meet her." So I did, and it was an interesting night. We ended up going to leaving and watching a show after the award show, and it was an interesting night.
So she didn't kind of put out a hand like, "Oh, you're my husband's daughter. I want to get to know you." Anything like that?
She did, yeah.
Reached out to me even. I received text from her saying like, "Hey, we're your family. You have family out in Texas. We have a ranch that you guys could come out to." It was so short how it lasted, but it seemed very sweet at that point.
What year was that? Was that 14?
This is when I was in college, so it had to have been like 2014.
Yeah.
Let's talk for a second about Phil. And there's a little bit of a contrast between Phil and Don. They both had problems related, I think, to drugs or alcohol. But
I wouldn't say Uncle Phil had a problem with drugs or drinking. Uncle Phil was very in control of his life, and
because when he wanted to stop, he stopped.
Drugs I wouldn't say at all, but drinking, he was a very controlled man, and nothing ever got in his way that way.
Okay, and that makes sense because he seems to be a contrast in many ways from your dad. I would say that some would say that your dad was the better musician for sure. He's a wonderful guitarist, and that's what he focused on, I guess, primarily.
And I wouldn't say that at all either, because the Everly brothers were the Everly brothers because together they made something special and they made magic together. I mean, my dad was maybe the better guitarist, that's true, but Uncle Phil was a good songwriter, and his harmony made the music. I mean, that's what sets them apart. And, even grandmother used to say, Phil could have been an opera singer if he wanted. That was, everybody knew that about Uncle Phil.
And speaking of your grandmother, what were her thoughts on the boys and how their life was going? And did she have any relations with his wife or wives?
No, she had met them a couple of times, and she was horrified by it. She just didn't think it was a good situation. And I had mentioned before that my dad was the more fragile one of the two, and my grandmother, she worried about him. She didn't worry about Uncle Phil because Uncle Phil was a strong man who took care of things. But my dad was fragile, and she knew that he was susceptible to bad influences. And that's when I mentioned earlier about Karen Prettyman, who was in his life, his third wife. She was very much a caretaker of him. And that's what I would have wished for my dad in the end, is that he would have had a caretaker that would have given him a beautiful life and, meals and clean clothes and taking care of him in a way.
But now, in fairness, though, Phil had invested in that, meaning he had given attention to his children, and family seemed to be, from what I've read, seemed to be more important to Phil.
Yes, it was. I mean, he was such a good father and grandfather. He was great to my children. He was the closest grandfather that they had.
He definitely filled in the places where my grandfather lacked.
Yes.
Like, he was there for my graduation. He was there for the big events that he could be there for.
As things that I didn't get from Uncle Phil from when I was young, because they had a house down in Columbia, Tennessee, and we got to see him a lot. And
we saw him more than we saw my grandfather, who lived 5 minutes away from us.
Well, and Venetia, I know that when we talked to you before, you had said that growing up you did change your name, and there was quite a bad breakup and divorce between your mom and dad. Do you think that affected your relationship with your dad, that his feelings were hurt because of that? Or did he know that you changed your last name?
I really don't know. And I wish I could talk to him right now and kind of fill him in on things. When I did have that time with him in 2016, he took me and he goes, "I'll tell you anything you want to know." And I told him, I just want to start from now. Let's don't go over the past. And I mean, it would have eventually come out, maybe if we'd got more time, if it hadn't been, like I said, nipped in the bud. I would have liked to told him that. I'm sure as long as my mother was alive, there would have been troubles with me seeing my father, because she passed away in 2008, and she was extremely jealous of me talking to him. She personally just never got over him, honestly.
Yeah, relationships. But you changed.
Young when she married. She never grew up mentally.
Well, when you got older, though, you did change your name back, and
I changed it when I went into high school.
Okay.
They asked for the name, birth certificate name, and I was able to do it then.
Okay.
And at that point, I said, I don't care what happens in my future. I will never change my name from Everly, because I went for the years with a name that wasn't mine, from the age of like 5 years old to 14. And I haven't. I've kept my name that whole time.
So let's shift gears and let's go to 2011. So your dad does his estate planning, and he apparently had a reputable law firm.
Very.
And I was impressed with the care with which they assured or tried to insulate this planning from challenge down the road. It was as if the planning was done with an expectation that there might be challenges from the children, which is not shocking when you have famous people and children from prior marriage. And sometimes the decision is, understandably, to exclude them for reasons relating to the children. But in any case, so we have your dad. He goes to the law firm. He not only makes a plan in which his assets are to go primarily to his wife, entirely to his wife if she's alive. And then if she's not, then I think it all went to her sister, the twin sister, Adelaida. And then thereafter, whatever was left would go to charity.
Yes.
I think that was the original plan. But what was interesting about this is that there was a recording made at the time to allow Don to state why he was doing what he was doing, which is not an unusual step, incidentally, when you're doing estate planning and you anticipate a challenge, because it allows a jury or a judge to actually hear what the reasons are that you're doing something that is atypical, that you're doing something that kind of violates conventionality. And in this case, he said under oath, apparently, or in this recording, he said that he had no relationship with his children. I think he said that he hadn't seen you, Venetia, since you were 8 months old. When I think, of course, as you've told us before, he had seen you, not a whole lot, but he had seen you. But after that,
picture with him from in the 80s when I was in my early 20s. And even when I was going through my mother's paperwork, he filed for custody of me and when I was 2 years old, and he states in there the differing times he was watching me at that time. So I listened to the transcript, and he was capable because the bar is very low, evidently, for being capable to write a will.
competent, yeah.
And I don't feel he sounded very professional in this transcript. He also had to mention, they asked him about my grandmother, and that's another thing that's shocking to me that's not really been brought up, is he didn't leave anything for my grandmother. Granted, she was very older than him. I mean, 17 years older, however old difference there was. But like my Uncle Phil left something for my grandmother, in that case. And it's just interesting to me.
But at one time, didn't he attempt to obtain conservatorship over your grandmother?
He did, and that's what it was brought up to me a lot. Well, he was still mentally at himself in, I think that was 2020. But he actually, what people forget is he dropped out of that case because of health concerns. And if you look
So
at
it wasn't just because he wanted to,
Yeah.
it's because he didn't feel like he was able to.
Well, and and hit the transcript on that is, I mean, really, it's very all over the place. His reasonings and things, and very disjointed. What he said about my grandmother, and he did not seem capable at all of having a conservatorship over her. And he said that he would just hire someone to take care of it. And I think, if anything, it's incriminating to him as being capable in 2020, as opposed to saying, well, he did testify in 2020.
Yeah, and also a further step that the estate planning law firm took to assure or to fortify this estate planning was that he came alone. So that's another fact that comes up when you have will contests or efforts to challenge a will in which you allege undue influence or coercion, is that this person made the appointment with the estate planning and we'll assume it's a wife in my example. So we'll say that the wife is being accused of having undue influence. So if it turns out in testimony during the trial that she made the appointment, that she drove the husband there, that she went into the meeting, she was present when he was asked, what do you want to do? Those can be construed as telltale signs of undue influence. So it looks like this law firm, was good at what they do, and they had apparently told him, I'm guessing, to come without anybody, and that it was noted that he was there by himself. From what I could tell, there was a note to that effect. But
as opposed to in 2019 when he was in a lawsuit, I think that was even earlier to 2017 when he was in a lawsuit about Kathy's clown ownership. He wouldn't be alone, and they had asked him to testify alone, and he basically, Adelaida, the sister-in-law, was with him in those testimonies and with my grandmother. And even the Adelaida said that it was apparent that he had a very protective team around him. It's talking about that he wouldn't go in and be interviewed without Adelaida there.
well, when do we think that Adelaida moved into the home?
She was in the home I can speak for that she was in the home in 2014. They had turned in the basement or the lower level of the house into an apartment for her. And she might have considered that a separate home, but I think that she was there.
But I believe she even denied living there, even though all that renovation work was done, which was really weird, because just if you're assisting someone, just admit you're assisting someone instead of being like, oh no, I don't live there. And then all this renovation's obviously done for you being there.
Mm-hmm.
And then there were long stretches up until his death when Adela was not there, and Adelaida was the one who was there caring for him. And so Adela would be gone for months on at a time. Is that correct?
For months, yes. It did, like, from I kind of pieced things together by looking at the 911 calls and looking at the medical 911 calls, which were even more interesting, like to seeing like my father's fall from good health, in the last years. I don't know if that's the right word, but when he was
The beginning of the end.
yeah, the beginning of the end for him. You could especially see that he passed in 2021. In 2019, he was having a lot of 911 calls. And I'd mentioned to you earlier that we couldn't pull back any records from any of the hospitals, which, still wonder about that. How is that possible?
Yeah, it doesn't make sense to me.
So when Adela is staying there or staying wherever she's staying, Adelaida apparently began to assume the primary role of caretaker of both her sister and Dawn. Is that fair to say?
I would think, from what I saw, that would be fair to say, because she was the one, who she was basically working as a manager, caretaker, and conservator over her sister, who was in and out of facilities and having police altercations quite frequently those last few years.
So Phil, who we know died in 2014, do we think that he ever went to his brother as a brother and say, Don, what's going on?
I don't think so. I don't think they had that kind of relationship, but
I don't know if you would have been able to even talk to him if you could have.
I think that would have caused a problem with, because you mentioned earlier, they broke up in 73, and the reason they broke up was they were tired. They had been playing music for so long and they needed a break. And then when they got back in 83, they took it easier. I mean, but they had world tours. And then the very last touring they had was with Simon and Garfunkel. That was a very easy set for them. And they were getting older. I wouldn't say they broke up. I'd just say that they just kind of slowed down to the point that they just weren't doing it anymore.
They fizzled out.
Yeah, just a dissolve.
Out
Yeah.
of it.
And it's hard to know what the assets were at the end, but we have talked before about the fact that there would be no reason for any shortage of income given the money that would have been still flowing in from the intellectual property, particularly copyright revenues. So you have to assume that there was plenty of money around for his needs, and apparently those around him, those two, and for the balance of his life. Is that your understanding?
Yes, I mean, I definitely would know that there would be enough. From what I've seen, not everything was, of course, in the estate, because, as we'll probably get into later, is that a little over a year before he passed, he signed over his publishing to Adelaida, and also quitclaimed his half of the house to Adelaida.
Well, before we go there, though, then let's go ahead and look at the next kind of estate planning event.
Okay.
So we talked about the preparation of the will in 2011. So 2017, you made reference to a codicil that was prepared earlier, and the codicil changed that original will to say that instead of all to Adela, it was 50% to Adela and 50% to Adelaida, correct?
Yes, and now Adelaida was now the executor.
Yeah, so it changed from an executor in which Adela was to her sister. So it still, though, has him, in a sense, it's not a change of his fundamental intent from 11, which was to give it all to one sister and not his children. And then so it was changed to give half to one sister and half to the other. I have to tell you as a lawyer that if you succeeded, which I think would perhaps be a better opportunity to challenge the 17 than the 11, but the 17 change, the codicil, even if you undid it, you're back to it going to one sister versus two of them. So it just seemed like as long as the 2011 stood, and it's not surprising to me that it has stood, just based on what little I know, and some of the reasons of which I've indicated. And then the 17, it clearly, that was a time in his life when he was not as clear-headed. He was more dependent. So there's lots of reasons to have suspicion around that, which is important for family members, of course. But as a lawyer, I'm thinking, even if you succeed in setting that aside, it's kind of like you've gotten nowhere.
I mean, I might disagree because in the 2000, I thought it was a 2000 will, and then the 2000, there was two wills, 2010 and 2011.
Oh, I didn't know I didn't know there's a 2010 will.
I believe so, because the 2011 transcript that was talking about that will, I believe, I could be wrong. There was a few wills that weren't submitted even, and the 2017, the biggest change I see, because considering if everything had gone to Adela, the sister was still conservator over her, so she still would have been somewhat in control.
Yeah, that's right.
But in 2017, it made it where the sisters were able to have inheritors. It wasn't going to charity anymore. And I personally, I would have fought for it to go to charity, because having talked about this being a family act that began with my grandmother and granddaddy and moved on, I would prefer that as to it going to a family that has no connection with him.
All I know is
Okay.
my great grandmother was very much encouraging us to pursue this, and she was happy about us contesting the will. So
Now that's a fair point.
the family, I like to think, is on our side.
You're right. That's a fair point. Lawyers, I'll just speak for myself. Sometimes I go to, how do I get more for my client? And your argument is, had the 17 been set aside, put aside the 11, or heaven forbid the 10, put aside the earlier will. But you make a point that had it not gone to Adela, then it would have gone all to charities. And that was an important goal.
I mean,
I reward bad behavior at that point.
Yeah, why give it to
I'm
people
sure
who
that
didn't know?
was put. I can't imagine that he, at that point in 2017, really thought that was important. I'm sure that was important to someone else, to make sure that that was being able to be put down to another family.
So
Money wasn't even in his control, because he couldn't even get insurance for himself. He wasn't able to use money for his own needs. It seemed like it was kind of up to them and what they wanted, and their decision was for themselves and their family. And yeah, that might be nice for their family, but it wasn't right.
I don't understand too, is because a lot of people are, signing away their music and themselves as artists. And if they would have been able to do that, having that caveat in there that it would go to charity after, that might have been a problem.
Oh, I suspect it would. But in any case, let's go to another important event that you made reference to a while ago. And if we have a setting here in which I think we've painted by implication, and again, none of us knows exactly, because that's the nature of being somewhat isolated or sequestered from the family members and others to some extent, is that you can only speculate. So I'll make clear that we're all a little bit speculating here as to what was going on inside that home at the very end. But I think it's fair speculation that Don became increasingly dependent on Adelaida, and that Adelaida had a degree of influence later that was stronger than earlier. I think that's a fair assumption, but it is an assumption. In any case, what we have is it was 19, wasn't it, that this transaction was made?
Oh, no, it was actually, I believe, in 2020.
Okay, 2020. So in
I
2020,
think that was less than a year in 2020. And I believe that it was a little more than a year, because he passed in August of 21. And I believe that the giving over his publishing to Adelaida was just months before that.
So let's clarify what we're talking about. So around in 2020, there was this document prepared in which Don transferred his house, the house he was living in, as well as some publishing rights, some rights with respect to, they call them recapture rights, but the rights that people who've written songs or family members can use to renegotiate contracts that allow them to come back and get a better deal. This was part of this was a result of the Sonny Bono laws that came around in, I think, 98 or so. So anyway, this, for reasons that we don't fully understand, we know that Don signed away the house and these rights to Adelaida or Adelaida and Adela.
No,
Just Adelaida, the
Adelaida.
sister-in-law, not even his wife, the sister-in-law.
Well, what I found interesting on the publishing was in the paperwork, he says, do not send any paperwork to my house. And I take that, and this is speculation, I take that as he didn't want Adela to know that he had done this.
Oh, I would bet on that.
Yes.
Don't you agree?
And with quit claiming half of the house to Adelaida, I find that I actually feel bad for his wife, because in the state of Tennessee, despite what a will said, she would have got the house in entirety. But instead, by him doing that, Adelaida got half the house.
The only claim would have been, and I'm sure it didn't come to this, would have been fraud on the marital estate when you do a transfer from, of what would be spousal property to another. But you're right that I suspect it was done discreetly. But so it was half the house. Is that correct?
Yes, because when I look back at the paperwork, that's the way I take it. It's half the house. Because Adela also owned, he had put her name on the house after they got married, so that in case, he passed away and it would go to her. But by putting Adelaida in his half part, he was able to keep that rule that happens of survivorship.
Yeah. Anything that's jointly owned as tenants in the entirety, which is what a couple is when you're married, is it'll go to the surviving spouse at death. So I guess his reasoning was Adela would end up with half, and so he wanted to transfer the other half to her sister, which I doubt she would have approved of. And then you wonder about these songwriting changes. These intellectual property rights, we talked a lot about on this show, how valuable they can be. And definitely the Everly brothers had some huge hits, especially during that 4-year period or so between 58 and 62. They must have had 10 top 10 hits. It was incredible.
Yeah.
They had 30 hits overall.
Yeah, it looked like he had stated that $300,000 to $400,000 per year he was getting in royalties in 2010. So I'm sure it would have only, increased over time.
I also want to point something out. I believe that those numbers would be much higher because that was probably before recapture of the songs. And by recapturing the songs, you're doubling the amount.
Yeah. So Don then dies in 21. The will is probated, I think, actually in 22, or at least your objection was filed in 22. The court, I see a court memo to that effect. So you did challenge the will, and you challenged it based on, among other things, undue influence. So the value of the estate, none of us knows for sure, but I suspect that it was north of $20 million. Would you agree with that?
I don't know. That sounds high to me. Of like liquid assets, that sounds high, but
total assets,
total
including
assets of like
intellectual property.
Features on the publishing and songwriting, sure.
Yeah, so that has to be goes into the valuation of the estate. So there was a significant amount there, and the family finds out. Probably you were not surprised, the family, that you were not in the will. As you mentioned earlier, you had been kind of clued in on that, perhaps through Phil to some extent, but you decided to challenge it because you felt there was undue influence.
That's true. Well, Uncle Phil had passed obviously away before my dad in 2014, but before he passed, he must have told me 10 times, honey, your dad's not going to leave you kids anything, and I'm going to be here to fight for you. And I talked to another half sibling who told me he told them the same thing. And he prepped us to it because he saw where it was going. He could see. And, he didn't have a lot of contact with my father at those last years. I'm glad he didn't know how the extent of
of how he was living.
Yeah, I'm glad of that. But he prepped us, and then he passes away first, and that was really hard for Don's children because we didn't really have a strong person to stand behind us. Uncle Phil was very, very upset about this and said that we should fight for our legacy, the kids, and that's what I did. And grandmother also. When I told her I was doing it, she didn't tell me. She didn't say go do it, but when I told her I was doing it, she cried and said, "I'm so proud of you." And that was really nice to hear from her because she's a tough woman.
Very tough.
And for her to say that was really, really nice.
So that really hasn't gone as you had hoped it would, though.
No, it didn't. And I think there were some things bungled early on. There were, we had discoveries and things weren't followed up on. And I don't think there was a lot of support from my first legal. At the beginning there was, but then it sort of faded out. And then I was kind of behind the 8 ball at the end when I had a summary judgment taken against me because the summary judgment was quoting the 2011 will, which was very well executed. Whereas if they quoted the 2017 will, we could have been like, which is the one they were using.
Or codicil, yeah.
Codicil, there was room there, wiggle room there, but the proof that was in the summary judgment, there was no answer to. Yes, he said his children weren't in there.
And we've kind of talked about what some of the challenges would be if someone were to challenge those. So, it was valiant that you were prepared to do something largely on principle.
That's what that has been. This is exactly, you hit what I've been doing. This has been on principle. And I
don't think either of us would be able to sleep at night if we felt like we didn't do everything we could.
I just felt that
we had so many family members like my Uncle Phil and my great grandmother just say like, you guys need to do this. And it's encouraged us because it's been such a difficult road to get to this point, because it's been how many years at this point?
3.5
years of what
coming
we feel
up
like
on
fighting.
4 years, yeah.
And it's still, we're gonna just keep on keeping on. We're not gonna stop until we feel like everything's been done.
I've tried everything.
Then I have this younger generation that keeps propping me up because there's times when I said I just want to stop, but sometimes you just have to take a stand on certain things, and this was one. It was
our hill to die on it. We're willing to at this point.
Well, no, I respect that. I can imagine it would be hard for, children to feel helpless with a parent in similar circumstances. And I'm sure some of the people watching this, in some way, they see something that resembles what they have faced or what they expect to face. So I want to thank you guys for both participating and sort of telling your story. And I think that it'll do justice to your dad's memory, to his brother's memory, and to this story as an opportunity for people to learn. And one thing that I do at this stage is I like to break away before we wrap up and kind of just make some general comments about lessons here. And some of them are embedded in our discussion. So some things that I've said along the way, you've said along the way, are things that people need to take note of. But also I would add that when you use, I have in italics here in my notes, I have life manager, choosing a life manager. We all need to set up somebody that we can trust when we become frail and we're not able to do things for ourselves as we've done our whole lives, at least since we were, past a teenager, we've ran our lives. But we have to anticipate the fact that we may continue living for a period substantially past the time that we can continue doing that. And people would use different words for the person that is their life manager, but often it's a spouse. But sometimes a spouse is not the good choice. Even if you have a good spouse, the spouse may not be the good choice. And if you have a bad spouse, he or she's definitely not the good choice. So, I think one of the walkaways here is, we all need to give a lot of thought to who's going to have a durable power of attorney to run our things, our life, who's going to be the trustee in our trust that may be in effect while we're alive, and who's going to take care of things when we're gone to assure that what we've laid out happens. Who's going to make healthcare decisions. So everybody needs to have in their life somebody that they can totally and unqualifiedly trust, and then have a name too in case that person gets hit by a train. But I think in Don's case, and commonly, there wasn't that person, but it's in part because you get the sense that Don didn't pursue those relationships with the people around him who were candidates to become those people.
When I did spend a few times meeting up with him at Starbucks, we were talking, and I wish he got from me that I would have come in the middle of the night. I was not scared of the girls. I would have came and helped him. I just wish, and I was so close. If he was scared, and I know he was at times, because, I have one friend that he spoke to that he called, and he was actually scared in his own house and sleeping with a gun next to
I
him.
think there was even a legal document that said he was fearful at the house or something.
Yeah. And, I would have come and got him out of there. There were times I'd go and sit on the doorstep of his house when I would hear about something bad happening and knock on the door, and the door wouldn't be answered. He was in a wheelchair and blind by the end of his life. So that's another thing I would like to consider, is like, how did he sign those papers when he had macular degeneration? And how could he have, handled those last things of transferring in 2020?
Yeah, yeah. And this is the circumstance of so many older people, rich or poor, and maybe for slightly different reasons, but both find themselves in a position to be either simply ignored or to be exploited, and both are bad. But in this case, there wasn't that life manager. And I also argue that apart from that person is primary, but apart from that is to have chosen expertise for whatever the particular needs are of each of us. We all know if we're going to have serious health needs, then we need to think about that expertise while we're still capable of selecting it. And especially when you have certain types of assets. Now, we know from these past shows that many times when you have intellectual property issues like copyright revenues, et cetera, royalties, then it makes sense to have somebody who's professional in that area, and these companies now are all over, and they provide documentation, they keep accounts, and they make decisions and run something that requires expertise. And often we find that sometimes those decisions are left in the hands of family members who don't know how to who or simply don't want to make the right decisions. And sometimes those assets deteriorate, or they lose value, or deadlines pass.
I'm not even sure that Adela was being looked at financially, because if your twin sister's taking over for you, I know that she had some mental issues, but there were tweets she made that looked like she thought she was being possibly exploited. And I've had no contact with her. And I'd also
at one point, she even brought you up.
Yeah, she even brought.
She was like, "Where was Venetia's will?"
She had a picture of the will, and she wrote on the top, like, "Where's Venetia, Don's firstborn, in this will?"
So
that
was very confusing.
Very confusing. We don't know how many more wills that maybe weren't found, or more than likely we probably weren't any wills, but that was always a consideration.
We'll never know.
Never know that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like
I actually have some sort of sympathy for Adela.
Yeah, it sounds like you really need an aging life team. Not just one person.
That's a good point.
A whole group
that's a
of
good
people.
Point. Yeah, that would be ideal. But ultimately, it's good to have at least one person that you can have head that team. But no, you're right. It ultimately, the people required for many of us, depending on how complicated our lives are, certainly somebody such as Don, is you do need more than one person. But the time to test them and to be confident of their capabilities and their honesty and integrity, is not when you get in the state that Don was in when he was, let's say from 2015 on, or maybe even earlier. I mean, the time to do that in our lives is, when we're still fully capable. And it also means preserving relationships. And that leads to another comment I would have. It's an odd comment. Usually when I'm saying where things went wrong in an estate plan, usually I'm talking about things that if this person, were sitting here today, they would readily agree, oh yeah, that's not what I wanted. That went way sideways. I wish I could have prevented that happening. Don, in a sense, it's the comment is that he had a set of goals that he might have realized, meaning he may have felt what I want to do with all my stuff, what I want to do with my attentions, et cetera, is pour it on these two women. That's not entirely, I would question that if that were entirely inconsistent with his earlier life. And it's a little critical, Venetia, so I apologize, but I know that these things you've kind of lived to some extent. So in Don's case, in a way, he got the estate plan that he wanted, maybe with some variation, some manipulation, but still, we still have that fundamental plan. And so my criticism is that if in fact that was the plan he wanted, and I know you may challenge that, but if it were, then my criticism is, do you really want to I say to the people watching, do you really want to develop a plan where you consciously exclude the people, everybody in the world with which you have the most naturally important connections? And children will, for all human history, fall in that category. Now, it's different if your kids are bad or they've done terrible things to you or others. And we all sometimes, any of us think, but for God, we could all have children like that. But that's not the case here. It's often not the case. We did Larry King recently, and it's a similar point. So my criticism, in a way, is what the person who did the estate planning even wanted here. Is that to be discouraged? And I would argue it is to be discouraged, but that's a value judgment. But there is a question, as you've already pointed out, that was his plan what he really wanted at the end of his life? One thing about it, they were a very talented group, he and his brother, and made some great music.
That we get to treasure forever. And you're a part of that, ladies. I mean, that's your legacy.
Well,
that's why we're fighting so hard for it.
But it doesn't feel like it presently, but the music's almost too painful to listen to right now.
I can understand that. So I do wish you the best with your continuing efforts. And also, let me make a note that we're going to do a follow-up to this segment for those watching, in which we are going to talk to somebody who was involved in passing legislation in Tennessee that now assures that family members and other friends and family, I should say, can gain access to somebody who would otherwise have been isolated in old age. It could be in a facility, it could be in a home. But this legislation assures that those problems that many people have complained about, and in particular in Tennessee, and I think some of this arose from related to Glen Campbell, a little bit of a sneak preview here, but it was something that needed to be addressed. The best way to shed light on problems like we've talked about here with respect to your dad, Venetia, is that if you all could have had access, if you all were allowed ready access, and I think that that's an important component of solving many of the things we've talked about. So we're going to be talking to a family member who was involved in getting that legislation passed in Tennessee, and we're going to go over briefly what the terms of that law is. It's not unique to Tennessee, incidentally. Similar laws exist in a number of other states, and it's a marvelous thing. So that's coming up. But Arabella, Venetia, I want to thank you all. Marvelous that you all would take time and talk to us about something that's dear to your heart, but can be a little painful.
I was shocked, though.
And then
how
did you meet Venetia, sweetie?
Well, I met Venetia. Venetia had emailed me and had sent me emails, and then I had started talking to her. And actually, it was from the Kasem Cares, some of the bills that we had passed. And when I started talking to her and getting her story, I looked and I was like, I think there's some bills in Tennessee that we've already passed, because I work with Senator Crow, and there's some bills that could possibly help you with this whole quest of what's happening with your father.
Joining us now is someone all too familiar with being separated from a family member, a famous father-in-law and father. With us now is Trudy Campbell, the wife of Travis Campbell. Travis is here as well, the son of the late country artist Glen Campbell. So we welcome you all to the show. I know this isn't your first time being with us, but, you know, we really want to talk to you again and revisit what was happening once your father and father-in-law was diagnosed with Alzheimer's in 2011. At the time, he was married to his fourth wife, Kim. And just tell us a little bit more about your relationship at that time when all of that was happening.
Well, I'll let Travis tell that part since that's his father. So, and go ahead and tell what had happened.
Basically, at that time, Dad lived in Los Angeles. And then he lived in Malibu, and I lived in Kansas, just south of Wichita. People ask me why I moved here, and I say I moved here to look for that lineman guy, you know, Dad used to sing about. but anyway, like when we would be playing golf, I mean, Dad always told jokes. But when we would be playing golf, he would tell me the same joke 2 or 3 times during the round, and I could tell, you know, something was kind of
a little off, yeah.
But then I didn't really know. I didn't really find out about it at the Alzheimer's diagnosis until they came out with it publicly.
Well, yeah, usually, I mean, there's signs, but you don't ever want to like really think about it because like, oh, you forget your keys. These things happen with Alzheimer's. And then it, like you said, it just gets worse. You notice some things are off. But once he was officially diagnosed with it, can you kind of tell us a little bit more about how your relationship changed a little bit?
It was kind of tough. I highly suggest if you have things you want to tell your parents or a loved one, tell it to them now, because there was a lot of things that I had in my life. I mean, just from things growing up. I mean, nothing critical, but just things that I had in my mind that I would have wanted to talk to my dad about. Whereas, before it was either his business manager, like, don't bother Dad with that, you know, just leave him be, don't bother him with that. And then when it got to a point in my life to where there were things that I wanted to talk to him about, he was in the place to where he wasn't really cognizant of things, and I couldn't really talk to him about that. So that's one thing that I regret, that I didn't talk to him about things that I wanted to prior to, you know, him becoming uncognizant. But once that took place to where, you know, he wasn't cognizant, and my stepmom Kim kind of took over every aspect of his life, it changed a lot. The relationship definitely changed a lot because he wasn't in control of his own life anymore. And then basically that kind of led us to these bills that we passed to where we weren't able to see Dad in the memory care facility. And then what ended up happening is Rusty Crowe and Carrie Kasem. Rusty Crowe was the state senator, and Catherine Falk. But Carrie Kasem was incredibly helpful with us to get these bills passed and give us, you know, advice, because she had gone through the same thing with her father, as well as Kelly Rooney, Mickey Rooney's daughter, was part of Kasem Cares. They're on the board with us.
And it was something that you and your sister also did together. Now, your sister, she's your stepsister, Debbie. Right. The two of you, I guess, you started talking and you noticed what was going on with your dad, as well as how, I guess, neither one of you were able to see your dad. And what about the rest of your siblings, too?
One of the big things, which with Debbie and with Travis, when you think about it, and Debbie had been on the road with her father, and they had like a very best friend relationship, you know, and you think of 25 years together, being on the road, traveling together, and the same band, and then all of Glen's familiarity, it was stripped from him. Debbie was fired. She found out when she was going to London, she was called and told her services would no longer be needed. Debbie tried to show up. She couldn't see her dad at the shows. His band was fired. So how long did the tour go on? It was like 2 years?
The farewell tour.
So that farewell tour had went on that long. Well, Travis, anytime he tried to go to a show of his dad's show, and he couldn't get back to see his dad. And same way with Debbie.
Especially Debbie, because Debbie's the one that used to let people backstage.
Yeah.
And then when she went to some of the final farewell tours, they wouldn't allow her to go backstage. But that's basically what prompted us to get involved with the state senators.
Well, and the biggest thing that started was, you would think, now if you think about it, okay, our general human, like our human rights, you should have the right to see somebody you love.
Exactly.
You should have, okay, if you're in a nursing facility, you should be able to get a telephone call and you should be able to open your mail.
Correspondence.
And those are just things that we don't think about that you think just obviously as a child, you should be able to go see your parent.
As long as you're not a detriment.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I knew, and I had never really been involved in anything like that. And I found it, I was like shocked when Travis and Debbie could not go in to see their dad. I seen how devastated they were. I seen Glenn, how he hugged Debbie, how he hugged Travis, how he wanted to see them. And to have somebody tell you, no, he don't need visitors today. I was shocked. I really didn't know what to do. So, and I seen both Debbie and Travis, how upset they were. I mean, how devastated they were in hiring lawyers. They didn't know exactly what to do as far as with the lawyer. What do you do? What kind of lawsuit do you do? What do you do to get in to see your dad? Well, that's when they were saying, well, the law is, okay. I started calling and I talked to Catherine Falk. And Catherine Falk, who's Peter Falk's daughter, had told me, she said, I've been trying to get a hold of the senators in Tennessee to change some laws. And here's the telephone number. So I started calling Rusty Crowe. And in the meantime, I also got a hold of Carrie Kasem. That's how her and I met.
And that's Casey Kasem's daughter. What a case that has been. Have they found their father's body?
Yeah.
Okay, they did? Okay.
In Sweden, I believe it's buried in Sweden.
Okay.
Oh, Scandinavia. Somewhere.
Okay. That story is crazy. Yeah.
Somewhere
heartbreaking.
Been. Isn't that insane? Who would think that would happen?
Yeah.
But what ended up happening is when I talked to Senator Crowe, prior to that, literally, he's like, how many days? How long has it been since they seen their dad? I said, it's been like 2 months right now because she's saying it's in mediation and unless they settle, they can't see their dad. Here's the emails.
Either we dropped it and we could see him or we settled.
Yeah. So I showed the Senate the emails and I said, here's what's happened. And it was one of those things they said, we've got to do something like fast because Glenn's in this nursing home. They might not ever get to see him alive again. That was how all of this legislation started. And since that time, we passed that law. There's some other things in the law, but they got taken out. Our main things was to make sure that if you love somebody and you're put in a nursing home, you have the right to see that person. As long as they're not a detriment to you, and as long as a judge don't say it's a detriment to you, you have the right to see that person. You have the right.
Telephone calls, and correspondence.
Yes, those. And so they passed that. They passed the bill. And then when Travis and Debbie went to see their dad, this was, I think, 2 days after the bill had passed, the nursing home wouldn't let Debbie in. It was Debbie and she'd taken one of Glenn's good friends and they wouldn't let her in. So I called Senator Crowe, called him again and I said, hey, they're not letting them in. He says, hold on. So he then faxed over a copy of the new bill that was put into, Tennessee law. And then that's how Debbie had got in to see her dad. And then after that, I started telling him kind of what had happened with Travis's mother, with Billie Jean Campbell and her trust and where did all her money go. Now, Billie Jean wasn't an elder, but it kind of went along the same.
Mom.
Yeah. Billie Jean Campbell was Travis's mom, but it was kind
Glenn's
of the
second
same
wife.
line.
Correct.
Right.
She was with him during all the hits. They moved from Albuquerque to LA together.
Yeah. And so I had told Senator Crowe, I started sending him over the documents of what had happened to all Billie's money. I said, you know what, if there's any kind of laws that we can pass in Tennessee, because you wouldn't believe how many elderly people are having this happen to them. Because after working with Carrie Kasem, and we go around the country with the Kasem Cares Foundation, and we pass bills. And Travis can tell you a little more about that.
We would testify at state legislatures, regarding bills, to try to pass that were similar to the bill in Tennessee. We also went to Washington, D.C. to try to get it, passed federally. That hasn't worked yet, but we're still working on it. And and she's an incredible advocate for elder abuse rights. It's not just like a stepmom or this. There are conservators that are appointed by the court that are very unscrupulous as well,
A lot of it's family members, though. There's a lot of people that it's close to, an elderly person. And when you think about it, we did the show with Billie Jean. Okay. and asking what
That was
happened
in
to
the
Billy's
previous episode.
and what happened to Billie Jean's money. And when you go through, literally elderly people have this happen because Billy had got sick and was, dying of cancer.
She died from breast cancer.
So it's almost, that's a vulnerable adult there as well.
Yes.
And you're looking at assets that had been taken from her, but then on through the years after she passed. But really the whole thing, the laws that passed after the bill that was in 2015, I think is when the Campbell Falk bill was passed. The laws that have passed after that, a lot of that have been on financial exploitation of an elder.
You all started it. I mean, you have fought so hard. You had the Campbell Falk Act.
Carrie, though, too.
2016.
Carrie, in California, Carrie did, an immense job of that. And then one thing I want to say is, one of her key things that she says, which is so true: isolate, medicate, steal the estate. They isolate them, they medicate them, and then they try to take the money.
Well, money does crazy things to people, and they get really greedy. And let's face it, your father, he had such a wonderful career going all the way back to playing with Elvis Presley.
Yeah,
he had lots of stuff,
Yep. One thing I want to say, though, people say that money changes you. I disagree. I think money reveals your true character.
Yes, I would say that as well. And sadly, you've had to deal with some characters that weren't so nice.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
And
I was shocked though.
And then
I was
how did
shocked.
you meet Venetia, sweetie?
Well, I met Venetia. Venetia had emailed me and had sent me emails, and then I had started talking to her. And actually, it was from the Kasem Cares, some of the bills that we had passed. And when I started talking to her and getting her story, I looked and I was like, I think there's some bills in Tennessee that we've already passed because I work with Senator Crow, and there's some bills that could possibly help you with this whole quest of what's happening with your father. And so that's how her and I met. She started telling me a lot of the stories, and she sent me over a lot of the police reports that was filed, and then the high-speed car chases.
Yes.
And did you hear about all this?
Yes, we saw the rap sheets, and it was quite shocking, all the different things that were going on. But Trudy, how it's wonderful of you to be so open to talk to those who are kind of going through the same thing, because there's a lot of similarities with Venetia and you. It's the fourth wife, I believe, for both.
Yes.
And I must say, I am so blessed to have Trudy in my life. I mean, not just as my partner, but as of my best friend. It was because of her that all of this got rolling, all of it. I had a heart attack back in 2014. And it's
did you hear about this?
No.
Everything that's been rolling. I mean, there's a video. It's called "The Day I Died." I didn't have oxygen to my brain for over 20 minutes. I was on life support. The doctor was telling them that they should pull the plug on me because I had no brain activity. Some people think I still don't, but that's a different story. But no, seriously, Trudy said, let him rest, let him sleep. And eventually I came out of it. It's solely due to Trudy about all of this. I mean, the legislation, everything that's going on is all due to her.
Well, and it's just grown so much. So you started out with the Campbell Falk Act that happened in 2016. Sadly, you lost your father and father-in-law in 2017. But 2017 was also a year that another law was enacted. So can you tell us more about that?
Well, that was the financial exploitation law. And actually, I really like the looks of this, because if somebody has taken a vulnerable adult, and if you think about it, they don't have the mental capacity sometimes, and they call it undue influence or diminished mental capacity. But the undue influence is more like somebody has swayed them to make a financial change, and usually for the betterment of, whoever is the conservator or the person that's in their life. And the reason why I felt like that the 2017 law really affected Venetia is it's a perfect example. And I like to give examples on a lot of things. For example, when an elderly person has wrote a lot of songs and they have it in publishing, They love their publishing, but that's their money that's coming in. A year before Don Everly passed away, he gifted all of his publishing rights to a sister-in-law. All right. Then he also gifted his house. Now let's think, say if he lived another 12 years, what would happen? How's he going to support himself? If you give all of your financial assets, and would that person have done that had they been 25, 35 years old and of clear mental capacity? Would they give away their house? Would they give away all their publishing rights? Usually no. And that's one of the things which we felt like people needed to be protected so that they don't have that happen. Because otherwise, I've seen a lot of cases, believe it or not, just in working with Kasem Cares, well, somebody will give everything that they own away, then they're like left homeless. They're like left living in a low-class nursing home that they can't even afford to be there, and the state's paying for it. So when you think about that, it really kind of puts that law into perspective. And what that law states is if somebody takes an elderly person's money, their financial means, their assets, that the district attorneys can prosecute them, they can freeze their assets in the same equal amount or more to pay back the victim. And I thought that was a great law. I think it needs to be known a little more. That there's a lot more bite now. If you're going to, take somebody that's diminished mental capacity, if you're going to take their assets, that there's going to be consequences.
Yes.
There's going to be jail time. Mm-hmm. And I like that law. I thought that was a good law. The thing I think with even the first law, which we had passed with the, just being able to see a parent or loved one get a phone call, get their mail. I felt like that we'll probably go back and change some things, because that needs to have a little more bite to it, like a more of a criminal penalty to it, that if it happens, the person needs to have consequences for it. Because could you imagine, being in a nursing home and not being able to see your kids?
And especially when it comes to Alzheimer's, usually with them, they remember further in their past than they do just a few days ago. So, Travis, you obviously were in your father's life way before Kim.
Sure.
Right.
So you would think that just for peace of mind for your dad, he would want to see, as far back in his history as he possibly could.
Sure. See, when we see England, he'd talk, he'd say, Where's your mom? Where's Billy?
Yeah.
Where's Billy?
Kind of funny. And towards the end, when because like I said, we had visitation for 4 hours at a time, twice a month. But when we would go down there, it's an 11-hour drive for us to go to Nashville, but we would go down there. And again, I had mentioned that Trudy wasn't allowed to go in, so she had to stay in the car. But when I would be sitting there with Dad, he'd kind of be off in like La La Land. But what would happen is you'd be looking at him, and for those of you that have family members that have Alzheimer's, you'd be sitting there and you're kind of staring at them in the eye, and all of a sudden he would like click, and he'd like look, and he'd look at me, and it's like, I sure love you, son. That right there, I just get chill bumps even recounting that. That's just, it's unbelievable.
And with more and more people getting Alzheimer's, our baby boomers, our biggest generation, I think this is wonderful what you all have done, because it's going to help so many other families who, may be suffering from Alzheimer's, a family member, whether there's divorce in there, other, wives or whatnot. But for the kids to be able to see those parents when they're having, the situation with Alzheimer's, you are helping these families. And I just want to say thank you for that, because in my past, I lost my grandmother to Alzheimer's. So, but everything was fine with my family. We all got to see Grandma. It was all fine.
You was able to see her.
Oh,
and talk to her.
Mm-hmm. Much different situation.
I sitting there with them, and they're kind of in La La Land. Yes. Every now and then they'll have moments of clarity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my grandmother, she didn't recognize her husband. She'd be like, they knew each other as kids. So she knew him, but she didn't realize she was married to him. And she would like get the giggles when she was like, that's my husband.
Oh, that's kind of, so she thought of him like when they was younger.
So yeah, it's very difficult, very, very, it's quite an adventure, Alzheimer's. So again, I feel for you and your family going through that. But again, you have changed things for the better. And what is on the horizon? What is next? I know these are laws that have passed in Tennessee. Are there other states that you know of that are following these laws?
Yes. I'll let Travis tell you about this. We went to Maryland, Michigan, And literally with the Kasem Cares
I think
Foundation, there's been
13 different states.
17 states.
17 states
that have passed the laws. And we've got quite a few more. And literally there was one of the things which Carrie Kasem was able to get in to see her father, Casey Kasem, was from the federal law. And see, there's a federal law. So we went to Washington, D.C. as well with Kasem Cares Foundation. It was Carrie Kasem, myself, Travis, Troy Martin, which was the lawyer that was writing the bills with Carrie Kasem, and Kelly Rooney, which her father is Mickey Rooney. So they went there and spoke with the senators and talked with them about changing some laws. But the biggest thing is just going from state to state. Arkansas was, a state which it got passed there as well. And it's just been a blessing. I want to tell you, when you join together with people, and when people hear the story, you start realizing you would not believe how many people I've had call me that said, "Hey, we can't get in to see." One lady, she couldn't get in to see her dad, and he happened to be in Tennessee. So I sent her over the bill, and then it was like the next day. And just, the joy and the gratification that you get from being able to help somebody, and all the long hours, everything that went into that bill, it pays off, and it just makes it feel really rewarding,
And like I was saying, like the recognition of Carrie's dad, Casey Kasem, Kelly's dad, Kelly Rooney, Mickey Rooney, and then my dad, Glen Campbell. It's neat because sure, those people are famous, but with the Kasem Cares organization, we go around and we try to pass these laws, like I said, that'll help people that we've never met before, and that's the neatest part about it.
Yeah, it's a legacy that your entire family is leaving for everyone for the future. So
now, I have talked to Senator Crow today.
Mm-hmm.
Him and I had talked about, your podcast and everything. And he had, because I kind of went over with him Venetia's story.
Yes.
And of course, I've become good friends with Senator Crow over the last, since the bills passed, because we worked side by side in doing this. But just seeing all of the other bills pass and then seeing the people that it's helping, I just can't even tell you. When Senator Crow and I was talking about Venetia today, it was like, hey, you have to look up to 2017 financial exploitation. And I sent you the list. There's been so many that have been passed. I mean, sometimes my memory gets a little foggy. So, and I'm like, oh my goodness, yes, you're absolutely right. And I don't know if you read it, but it's a fantastic bill. It's amazing.
And you have been such a great support for Venetia and so many others who may be experiencing having that parent who is now being isolated, not by their choice, because they're not completely, with it, shall we say. Some challenges that are going on, and you're there, and you've passed all this, and it's just great. I know you're not stopping. I know you're going to do much more.
And thank you for bringing awareness to this all.
And thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yes.
With that, I hope that this has been both enlightening as well as interesting to many of you viewers. Till next time, this has been another episode of Life's Third Act. Take care.
We hope you enjoyed Life's Third Act, sponsored by Cordell & Cordell, your advisors for estate planning and beyond. Subscribe and join us weekly for thought-provoking discussion and topics exclusively focused on estate planning and your financial future. Discover more at CordellCordell.com. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.